The wait has finally come to an end, again, as Bethesda just uploaded another episode of Constellation Questions, where they answer some questions from the community about their upcoming RPG, Starfield. The last episode, and really the last update from Bethesda on Starfield, premiered almost 2 months ago exactly. I don't think many of us were expecting the wait to be so long in between episodes, but at the very least it is over now. And this time around we had a more focused episode, as we got a variety of quest questions answered, and these were answered by Will Shen, the lead quest designer for the game. Will Shen is a pretty notable individual because he was also the lead designer for Far Harbor. A lot of people love Far Harbor, and he is the person responsible for the main story in Starfield, which is definitely exciting. The first question is asked around random encounters in Starfield and how they have been improved or expanded upon.
This time around we have entire planets that we have to populate, so we actually have new tech to take whole locations that we've built and put them on the planets. Now you could say maybe you're going to an outpost and you actually discover there's a whole group of people there with a particular problem, whereas before it might be just a person coming to you along the road. Now it's an actual whole location that can be put there.
And they go on to mention how this new random encounter system could function like, let's say you walk up to an entire outpost, and we may discover that a member at that outpost was kidnapped, and it'll point us over to a dynamically placed dungeon where we'll go and rescue that member. The system sounds really interesting, a huge upgrade over the current one, and I should probably explain what random encounters actually are in Bethesda games. These are those random events that can spawn when exploring in Fallout 4 or Skyrim. So for example, when you're just walking around the Commonwealth and you find a couple of enemies fighting each other, that's oftentimes a random encounter. There's actually a variety of things that could spawn there randomly to give the world some life. There's some more interesting ones like an active sniper in Fallout 4 attacking you, or even in Fallout 76 we had some pretty wild things like pipe. But for Starfield it sounds like this random encounter system has been massively overhauled. So now as you're exploring around one of the 1,000 procedurally generated planets, you may stumble upon an entire random encounter base. So rather than just being a couple of guys standing on the side of the road, you might actually have a full-scale base to explore, people to talk to, and a little mini quest where it takes you to a dungeon tied to it. And although it sounds like procedural generation will be used for a lot of the planets, what is covering those planets, these random encounter bases will be handcrafted by Bethesda. So there'll likely be a large variety of events that can occur that Bethesda made themselves. But when and where these interactions pop up on a planet will be more randomized. And they further clarified how you could basically experience random encounters anywhere on planets in Starfield. And to me this sounds pretty awesome. It seems like it's a nice middle ground of planets not being completely barren. So as you're exploring planets that oftentimes may be largely blank, every once in a while you will actually stumble upon something, and something that could be pretty interesting. Very early on in the main quest in Starfield, we're going to be returning to Earth's own solar system. We can see the solar system during the gameplay reveal. You see Sol on the map. And in Starfield, our own solar system is going to be dubbed the Old Neighborhood. And we're actually going to be going here for a purpose.
Sent there on a mission from Constellation to discover the mysteries of the artifacts, and you'll get in contact with the question of what happened to Earth, but also you'll go to Mars, and there's actually a settlement, one of the early settlements that humanity created after they left Earth. It's called Cydonia, and that's a whole city with its own problems and people to meet.
This was a terrific answer to what I have to say is a fabulously worded question. Yeah, that was actually my question. I asked that one in the Discord. They talk about how early on we're going to be faced with what happened to Earth. And I think this does kind of confirm that Earth isn't going to necessarily be a typical or familiar explorable area, which makes a lot of sense. I think this is what many people suspected. Something likely happened that destroyed Earth or is going to make it largely uninhabitable now. We know some of the other people in Starfield are collecting old Earth artifacts, which would make sense if the old Earth is largely gone, but at the very least, someplace we will be able to explore is Cydonia. And this does seem to be confirmed as the 4th major city. In the past, Todd Howard said Starfield would have 4 major cities. We knew about 3 of those with New Atlantis, Aquila, and Neon, but now we know the 4th one, which is going to be Cydonia, and this is actually a place on Mars. And it's described how this is one of the first space bases actually set up in the world of Starfield. We get to see this during the gameplay trailer. It almost looks like a mining base of sorts, but even beyond that, we actually heard about it in one of the earlier trailers, notably about Cydonia security. One pretty interesting aspect about Mars is we actually get to see it from 2 very different angles. Here we have a walking scene next to a Mars rover, which just seems to be in the middle of nowhere as far as we can tell. But of course Cydonia, one of the 4 major cities in Starfield, is also on the same planet, just elsewhere. Cydonia being one of the earliest set up space bases is actually a pretty fun concept. Perhaps this will be one of the poorest of the 4 major cities, and the people here may be heavily impacted over whatever happened to Earth. In the reveal trailer, they talk about the alien alien artifact, how it could be the key to unlocking everything. This will seemingly be a major plot point in Starfield, and perhaps the key is actually to figuring out what happened to Earth. The main quest here is going to give you a bit of a tour of the settled systems. This is the name of the explorable area in Starfield. So you'll be going around and actually finding out what each of the major factions are up to during the main quest. But they also describe making a decision to not put these factions in strict conflict so we could actually experience the game with each of them.
Do we make some of the factions be in conflict with each other? And we decided, we really want to make sure that you can play through all the faction lines independently of each other.
To me, this actually sounds pretty similar to Far Harbor's story format. You go over to Far Harbor, you get to meet each of the major factions relatively early on, and then you can do quests for all of them. Unlike the base game of Fallout 4, you're not actually locked out of content in Far Harbor. Until you finally decide the fate of the island, you could go down each of the individual quest lines. And it sounds like they're using this exact same format with Starfield. Early on during the main quest, you'll meet each of the major factions, and it'll likely introduce you to their quest lines, and then you could do all of those quest lines without actually interfering with each other. There's not going to be a point where you get cut off on one quest line if you're progressing another. Or at least that's my interpretation of what was said here. At the same time, you will still have the opportunity for choices and consequences influencing factions.
We really want the stories to be a little more personal, right? You're influencing the direction of where this faction is going to go. So say the politics of the Freestar Rangers, right? What's more important? Is it justice or industry, right? Where are you going to try to nudge them in this direction or another? So you don't necessarily end up as the head of every single faction of the game. But, obviously all the major characters in every faction quest line will be reflecting on your choices. But, it can have far-reaching consequences for what that faction is, what it cares about.
So the goal in our role in Starfield isn't going to be taking over one of the factions or declaring war on other factions, but rather we're going to be a cog in the larger machine of that faction and occasionally have some very critical decisions that can actually impact outcomes or the trajectory of that faction. Later on, they mention how during some of these quests, some of our decisions will impact whether or not people live or die, if they stay in factions or leave them. The Freestar Rangers that are mentioned are likely a subgroup of the Freestar Collective. This is going to be one of the two big factions, and they're almost more of a frontier-themed people. And I could envision how this choice with them would play out. Maybe when doing some of the quests for them, we'll discover that part of their territory has this valuable natural resource, and we'll have to decide, do we destroy the local population or destroy what's there to sell that resource, turn it into an industry, or maybe don't do that, actually preserve it and go a completely different route. They do use the phrasing of nudging factions in a certain direction here, so it seems like we are definitely only going to be a small piece of the machine, but we also hear a bit about some of the companion interactions with quests.
The companions along the Constellation storyline, which is the main quest, they'll have a lot of opinions and points of view about what the decisions you'll be making along the main storyline. We've also added in several times where you can ask them to speak for you. So you might have a companion with you and you'll be challenged to someone will tell you you can't get through here, and you can actually turn to your companion and say, hey, actually, could you handle this? And they'll actually speak on your behalf, and there could be consequences, good or bad, for what they happen to say.
This sounds really cool. It seems like companions in Starfield will be getting quite a bit more of their own identity. Todd Howard described how sometimes our actions will make our companions temporarily mad at us before they recover back to baseline. So we could do something and they'll be periodically mad until things blow over. And of course here we're seeing even more companion depth, where companions will have their own opinions and even be able to speak for us at points, but how their views or opinions can be reflected in how they respond to something and will potentially carry impacts as a result. They clarify further how companions will still have many of the familiar features. They could be traded with, they'll fight with you, and they'll even crew our ship, but overall it seems like these companions will have a lot more of their own identity in Starfield. They're going to have thoughts and feelings on things, and it's going to come in more and more in the gameplay and our experiences with them. There'll also be NPC reactions to how we specifically finish quests. During questline, characters will have feelings based on the decisions we made during that quest. Like perhaps this lady won't like it if we just massacre an entire camp to get that artifact versus peacefully trading with them. And it seems like our choices during questlines will impact the lives of some of these characters. They end off the video with asking for more questions to be submitted using this hashtag, but also looks like they're taking questions from the dedicated channel on their Discord and even from the Starfield subreddit. Overall, I really like these videos. I personally wish they were coming out a bit more quickly, like maybe every couple of weeks rather than every couple of months, but perhaps we will start to to see them a bit more often. One of the community managers earlier this week mentioned how, as we approach release for Starfield, these will likely happen a bit more frequently. Either way, that is the most recent episode of Constellation Questions and your update on Starfield. Hopefully you guys found this one informative, hopefully you found it interesting, but until next time, I thank you all again for watching, and I hope to see you all later.